Now we're ready to start the epoxying rebuilding process. We're going to be using AV's Epoxy Sculpt for this. You can buy this from Mackenzie, and all the other supply companies carry this. We're going to be using hot water. You could take this right out of the tap hot. I find it works the best if you heat it up in a microwave. You want it very hot. It makes the epoxying much easier. That's a big trick. Also, if it's very cold out, you might want to heat this epoxy up first by putting it in a warm room. Don't put this in a microwave, but if it's warmer when you start, it's much easier. Some of the tools we're going to be using are our scale roller. This is the same one we used to repair the back seam. A variety of modeling tools, like this one, anything similar to this. This is just another modeling tool. I'm going to be using a brush. This is for cleaning off our eyes after we set them. We have an upholstery pin we're going to be using for recreating some of the gill rakers into our epoxy. And the eyes we're going to be using, we've got these from Mackenzie Taxidermy Supply. This is the NFG series. You'll see the item number on your screen right now. This is a general purpose gold eye. It's kind of a darker golden color. That's really nice for bass. Bass can also have a reddish hint to their eye. It just depends. Sometimes bass eyes will have more of a brown color, but in this particular case, we're going to go with this darker yellow gold look. And we'll also need paper towels for this. To start out, we're going to mix our epoxy the same way we did for our back seam. It's a 50-50 equal parts mix. We don't necessarily want to mix up all the epoxy for all the repairs to start. Epoxy works the best in the first 20 minutes to a half hour. If it's warmer out, that's a little bit less. So you don't want to mix up too much so you're trying to do the intricate areas like the eye at the end with epoxy that isn't the best. We're going to start out with mixing up a 50-50 mix of each kind, about this size. It's always easier to mix up more later. And that way you're not wasting any either. You can see I have gloves on for this. You can get an allergic reaction to this. You can actually become desensitized to it over time if you use a lot of it. So I always wear gloves. I'm wearing medium gloves for this. I have fairly large hands and they fit really tight on my hands, which is important for sculpting work. You don't want a glove that fits really loose. You're going to have lines when you're doing your sculpting. After my epoxy is all mixed up, I'm going to put it on a piece of cardboard. I don't want to put this directly on the workbench. Over time, your workbench can get full of this, and it's not a very easy place to work if it's full of dried out epoxy. So I keep it on this. I also change my gloves and put a new pair on after I mix up, because my gloves have unmixed up epoxy on them from the mixing process. Start by epoxying in here. You can see this hole back underneath the gill cover. That area needs to be filled in. That's just from our skinning process where the gills meet the top of the head on. It easily breaks out there. So we're going to start by filling that with epoxy. Grab my paper towel piece. You're going to need this to dab off excess water. You don't want to get too much excess water on the fish scales or skin in any one area. It can start to buckle it up and rehydrate it. It's a little hard to see in here. And take a ball about that big, get a little bit of moisture on it. Take one of my modeling tools. Start pressing that back in there. I'm going to take my finger and smooth that the rest of the way and as far in as I can reach. You can see what that looks like. I'm going to recreate the gills in that area because I put some epoxy over my gills. So I'm just going to take the end of my modeling tool and sculpt the gills in, and I'll show you what I'm doing in a second. You can see what that looks like. Now we're just going to continue around the show side of the fish. We're going to be rebuilding this area here, the whole gill area where it looks sunken in. We need to fill that all with epoxy so it looks nice and smooth. We'll also be putting a small amount of epoxy where our pectoral fin starts because it shrunk in a little bit during the drying process. We're going to start at the pectoral fin. See, I just pushed a pin down that was up a little bit. Now when you're putting epoxy on to do your repairs, you don't necessarily want to put a big gob of epoxy on and then try to smooth it everywhere. You want to put smaller pieces of epoxy on and then work them throughout the area, and if you need to add a little bit more, you can come back and do that. That's one of the tricks to good epoxying. You can see I'm putting a little bit of water on my finger. I dab it on the paper towel, then I go back to working on the epoxy. I'm going to take my paper towel and dab off any of this excess water that's on these scale areas. There's a little spot right here, I need a little bit more epoxy. Take my modeling tool again and just smooth that epoxy into that gill area. Okay, we have that part done. I'm going to put a little bit now behind the pectoral fin. This is going to give it some strength behind there. If we don't put any back there, the fin could break off in time. You don't need a lot back there, and this is, again, you're not going to be able to see what I'm doing, but I'll show you when it's done. Just drop it behind, take my modeling tool, and just work that in. This will all become very self-explanatory when you're actually working on epoxying your fish. You'll see the areas that need it and don't. Every fish is a little different. Some of them need a lot of repair, some of them don't need as much. And take my eye brush now, and I'm just going to smooth that epoxy out behind that pectoral fin. And again, it's just difficult to see. You can see I put a little bit of epoxy behind there. So now we're just going to continue down to our throat latch area, just rebuilding this whole area so it looks natural. It doesn't look all shrunk in. I'm not getting it too far out onto my scaled area of the fish. I don't need any epoxy there. So there's no need to have your epoxy coming way out to here. We're just concentrating on the area that needs to be rebuilt. Dab off my extra water. Take my modeling tool. Just smooth my epoxy into the gill area. I'm kind of pushing it underneath the gills and just smoothing it in everywhere. Just take my finger again, smooth it one more time, and just come back with my tool. A professional epoxy job should have no seams anywhere where one part of epoxy was hitting another, and it should have an even flow across everything. Okay, let's take my paper towel again. Dab off any excess water. Now we're at the throat latch, and we're going to put some epoxy there to even that out and rebuild that area because it looks all shrunken in right now. What you'll get good at over time is learning how much epoxy you need for each repair area. Before long, you wouldn't even have to think about it. You'll just grab the exact amount you need. If you put too much epoxy on any one of these areas, you'll be spending your whole time just trying to move epoxy around you don't need. If you put too little on, you won't get adequate coverage, and your repair areas will keep coming through your epoxy. Here we have the show side area completed. Now we're going to work on the back side. So I'm just going to flip it over, smooth in the epoxy from our throat latch repair on the back side, same way as we did on the front. Okay, now we'll take some more epoxy. We'll just keep working all the way back around. We're going to be completely covering all this area where these pins are and all this foam. And when I start to work here, I like to actually push it against myself like this. Makes it a little bit easier. One trick you can do when you're epoxying is you put the epoxy in the low area or the repair area and you work to the high area that does not need repair. In this case, that's our scale line. If you start putting your epoxy in the high area and try to work to the low area, you're just going to be moving epoxy off the high area trying to fill into the low. It cuts down on the time and it makes it look a lot nicer. See, I'm always dabbing that excess water off. You can't do that enough. You can see we have that all blended in. Now we're just going to work back the rest of the way. Grab a little bit more epoxy now. We're on the back side of the fish where you're not going to see it as much. We don't have to be as careful back here. We just have to get this area repaired up. And again, I'm putting my epoxy in the low repair area to start and working towards the higher area, which is the scale line. Take my modeling tool and I'm just going to spread that out underneath my wood block a little bit so it looks nice and professional there. Again, take the modeling tool and I'm just going to push it underneath my gills just like I did on the show side. You can see I go back and forth quite a bit with this, with my finger and then back to the modeling tool and then back again. Okay, now we're going to fill in this back area under the gill cover right where the gills stop, just like we did on the show side. Get that epoxy warmed up in that hot water. Grab our modeling tool and then just push and shape that in there. See, I get some more water on my modeling tool as I'm doing this. What that does is that stops the epoxy from sticking to the modeling tool. It also stops the epoxy from sticking to your finger when you get your finger wet. I'm going with my finger and just finish it off as much as I can. We just need a little bit more up here. Again, you can see what I did. Just a little lean right here. Okay, we'll dab off our extra water. Now we need to go through and rebuild our gill rakers and a little bit of our scale area where the epoxy meets the scale. So we're going to start with the scale area. We're going to use our scale roller. I test it on my epoxy to make sure I'm going in the right direction to start. Again, get the water on it. That's going to keep our epoxy from sticking to it. I'm just going to scale through this area a little bit. Again, this is not very critical on the back side of the fish, but it still looks professional if you do it. And just take my finger and knock it down slightly, and then take my paper towels and dab that off. That dabs off any excess water, and it gives it a textured look. That's a good trick you can use when you're epoxying. If you need to have a transition area and you don't want to use your scaler, you can texture it with paper towels. On the show side, there should be some scales right here where the pectoral fin enters the body. You can do it with this. I'm going to try to do it with this for the video. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't, because you don't have a lot of room with this roller right here. Okay, I'm going to take my finger and just knock it down a little bit. And then dab that area really good with my paper towels. Before we recreate our gill rakers with our pin, I'm going to put a little bit of epoxy underneath the show side of the gill cover. This is going to strengthen it up. It's going to last a lot longer for your client if you do this. You don't need a lot under here, just a real thin coat. It's very important though that you 5-minute epoxy this before you put your regular or epoxy modeling compound on it. Otherwise, the moisture from this will distort your gill cover. That 5-minute epoxy coat we put on first stops that. And we'll just wipe off any excess water. Now we're going to use our upholstery pin, and we're just going to go in and recreate the gill rakers where the epoxy pushed over the top of them. Again, we get it wet, very important. You only want to bring these gill rakers out as far as the top gill raker. Okay, that show side is done. Now we'll do the same thing on the back side or wall side of the fish. As you're moving back around the gills, you can use your modeling tool to finish it off. Just take my modeling tool and I'm just going to go right along the edge of my gill rakers that I put in with my pin, just to level them off so they match. You don't want one gill that's pulled way out and one that's way in. What that'll do is when you try to paint that area red with our gill red paint, you'll have an area where there's no gill rakers and one that's sticking way out. So they should be level and even with each other the whole way back. That repairs the throat latch area. Now we need to move back and work on the rest of the fins. Okay, now we're going to work on rebuilding the areas around the pelvic fins. Now this does two things. It cleans them up and makes them look nice, but also gives them a lot of strength. When these fins are on somebody's wall or they're cleaning in their house, it's really easy for these fins to get broken. So putting some epoxy around them strengthens them up considerably. Again, the same procedure. We're going to get the epoxy warmed up and get a little bit of water on it. We're just going to start sculpting it around with our finger. You don't need to get a ton of epoxy on this. You don't want to get too much here at one time. Also, what we're doing with this is we're rebuilding some of the muscle detail that fish have at the base of their fins. You'll see that when you catch fish, they have like a rounded muscle area there. That's what we're rebuilding right now. See, I'm just pushing it into everything so you don't have any ridges or lines where your epoxy is. You don't want your epoxy to abruptly stop. It should flow into the rest of the fish. Okay, we'll put this on the show side, same way as we did on the back. You can see there we had a little bit of a hole. You could see some of our foam, so we covered that up right away. Keep getting that water dabbed off as we're working. Now we'll take our modeling tool. We're going to recreate some of the fin rays with our modeling tool. Again, we don't have an abrupt start and stop point with our epoxy. Everything just blends and flows in. Okay, now we're going to rebuild the vent area. See, we put a little bit of epoxy here. We don't want to get too much here, just enough to cover that foam. Then we're just going to carefully model that right into the surrounding scales. We just put our two little vent holes in with the back of our eye brush and just dab off any excess water. Okay, keep moving along. We're going to work on our anal fin. We had one little hole right here from our pin where we use to spread the fin out during the mounting process. So I just filled that with a little bit of epoxy. Do the same thing on this side. Again, now we're to our hard back fin. These were our silk span fins, and this was our no backing fin, just the fin glue. When you have the fins that are backed, you can do your repairs much easier, as you'll see with the tail in a second. We have a little hole back here on the very edge of the anal fin, so we're going to fix that right now with our epoxy. Pull some of that extra epoxy to the show side and smooth it in. I'm going to take up my upholstery pin and I'm just going to make a few scales in that epoxy, just so it blends in a little bit better for the painting process. And just dab off the extra moisture. Now we're going to rebuild the back of our tail area. We want to put just enough epoxy here to cover up that mache you're looking at. A lot of times the tail rays are broken on fish. You'll especially see that on Essox family fish like northerns and muskies, but any fish can have broken fins. If you have a fish like that, definitely use the hard backing method, and you can actually take some of your epoxy and put it on the back side of the paper in that area to help give it more strength. That's always a good idea. We'll take our scale roller and we're just going to roll some scales into that, make it look natural, and dab off all that excess water. Lay the fish back down. We have to repair some of the rays and splits in the tail of our bass. We're going to take epoxy to do that. Some of this can be fixed with glue, but if they're larger, it's good to do it with epoxy. Again, I'm just putting it into that split area and spreading it out. You don't want to have a big mound of epoxy in there, just enough to fill that area. We'll continue to do that across the entire top part of this fin. There's quite a few splits. Some customers like that, and you can actually just cut the fin backing away from that split area and keep those splits there. It's up to you and your customer. I find that most clients like it if it's cleaned up and made nice. So that's what we're doing today. A few little pinholes on both sides of our caudal fin or tail. Just filling those in. Take my paper towel and just wipe off that extra moisture. I'm going to take my modeling tool and I'm just going to recreate those fin rays. Take the modeling tool again and use the edge of it now. I'm going to recreate the larger rays. You just follow what's there. This is actually extremely convincing. When you get paint on, you won't even be able to tell we repaired anything. I'm just going to take a little bit of water on my finger and just smooth it out. Then I'm going to take my paper towel, just wipe right like that to clean up anything else. And that's repaired and complete. Now we're going to work on our soft dorsal. Here's a small area here where there's some repairs needed. So we're going to do the same thing that we did on our anal fin. Just get that area repaired. We're going to take our upholstery pin again and we're just going to recreate some of the scales from the area we put the epoxy on. What you're doing is you're just mimicking the scales that are there and blending right into those. A little bit on the back side. Take my finger and I'm just going to smooth those scales I made in with my pin to look a little bit more natural. And then finish it off with the paper towel. Same as before, just recreate some of these fin rays right into my epoxy so it looks natural. You have a nice even blend in. We're going to repair one of the fin splits on the soft dorsal, same way we did on the caudal or tail fin. Go ahead and make the rays in. with our modeling tool. Same as the tail fin. Dab off any excess. Now we're ready to move on to the top of our head. Okay, now we're going to rebuild the top of our head. This area shrinks in a little bit during the drying process, so we need to get some epoxy up there to rebuild it. Again, we put our epoxy into our hot water. Put it right on the top of the head and I just start blending it in. This is part of the rebuilding shrinkage part I was talking about. Most of the shrinkage you're going to be rebuilding is on the head of the bass. The gill rays can shrink a little bit, but our fin glue that we're going to put on at the end will rebuild that enough. We don't need to rebuild each fin ray. Again, the other way around having to do this part is to use an artificial head. You still have to do the head juncture, but you don't have to do any other rebuilding. Take my paper towel and just dab that off to blend it in. I like to actually hold it up and look at it. Sure everything's level. Everything's looking good. You can see where I'm at right now. We're going to rebuild this area, which is directly behind the maxillary bone. We don't need to put a lot of epoxy here, but this does dry a little wrinkly looking. So we need to just level that out and make it look a little more fleshy, like a fish would actually look. So we'll just put a little bit of epoxy in there. Repeat that process on the back side. Take my modeling tool and make a little line where the maxillary bone meets that area and dab off the extra water. And we'll do the same thing on the show side. Okay, we have a little bit of epoxy left, so we're just going to take a look inside the mouth to see what we have to do. There's a small hole at the very back part of the throat latch. We're going to repair that now. You don't have to use your best epoxy for this, so I don't know if there's any epoxy left before I set the eye. I'll go ahead and repair that area. You want to use very fresh epoxy for the eye and for rebuilding the area right underneath the jaws and the lip lines. It's going to take a ball of epoxy about this big. You're not going to be able to see what I'm doing here, but I'll show you what I've done after it's completed. We have the interior of the mouth completed at the throat latch where that hole was. You can see what we did there. Now we're going to set the eyes. We mixed up some fresh epoxy off camera. You always want to use fresh epoxy for setting eyes. We're using 18mm glass eyes, again from Mackenzie. This is the NFG series. Sometimes the different styles of eyes that are all measured in millimeter, but they don't always correspond the same way to the fish. What I mean by that is you can have a set of eyes that's 18mm in some styles and it's way too large. In other styles it might be too small, so you want to test it. First thing we're going to do is put a little bit of foam in the eye socket. We don't need to fill this entire eye socket up with epoxy and waste it. Epoxy is relatively expensive. I'm going to start taking some of my epoxy and just push it into the eye hole. Okay, now that we have the eye socket filled with our epoxy, we'll grab on to one of our eyes. We'll just start pushing it into place. Now when you're setting eyes, you don't want them bugged out too far. You also don't want them flattened back into the head too far like that. You want a slight roll down with the eye. Now some people will take their fish eyes and roll them way down, and that's fine. You can do that. That's more of a net look with a fish eye. Quite often when fish are underwater, their eyes are not rolled as much as they are when you have them in the net. Something to think about. You can just look at some underwater pictures of fish to see that. If you put a slight roll on the eye downwards, you'll also start to see the top of the sclera band on the top of the eye. We'll be rebuilding that mostly with paint. We'll put a little bit of epoxy there now, but we'll recreate that white look later because this eye does not have that. So once I have it set roughly where I want, I just hold it up and take a look at it. Also look at it head on. Make sure I'm getting it where I want it. Looks really good. So now we'll just build epoxy in around the eye. You don't want to put a lot of epoxy here for this step, but you want to put enough that you can spread it around it so you're not seeing any of your juncture area or the rest of the eye socket. You want a smooth flow in. Just work that right around the top part of the eye, smoothing it into everything with my finger. Dab off that excess water so it doesn't raise up any of our scales. Now we'll take our brush and we're going to clean the excess epoxy away from the eye. What we're doing is we're just rounding that eye out. Taking my finger and I'm just cleaning up around it a little bit after I brush it in. You'll have to go back and forth and do that a few times. Just get the excess water off. This also helps to blend that epoxy in. Again, we hold it up, we take a look at it from a number of different angles. You can see that it's kind of hard to see on camera. We do have a little bit of a pocket right underneath the eye here, and that is part of the eye socket where the eye is rotating down into. We also have a little bit of that on the top where the sclera band will be. Again, you look at it from a lot of different angles just to make sure everything is set. Okay, the front eye has been set. We'll work on the back eye. Again, it's the same procedure. I take a little bit of foam, just push that into that eye socket. I always like to check my front eye after I do that to make sure I haven't pushed on it in any way. I also like to blow that excess foam off my workbench. You don't want to get that foam into your epoxy. We grab our fisheye and we just start to push it into place. Again, I'll show you what I'm doing here in a second, but I like to look at it from a lot of different angles. Make sure that it is lining up with the front eye. Look at it down like this. So I need to bring the eye slightly forward to match it up. Look at it head on to make sure I'm at the exact same angles. Just move it a little bit more forward. You want to really make sure you get this accurate. That's what people are going to be looking at. Now that I think I've got it where I want it, we'll fill in around the eye the exact same way we did on the show side. Again, you don't want to put too much epoxy around the eye when you're doing this. just enough to fill in everything. Okay, we'll dab off all of our excess water. And we'll clean the eye off the same way we did on the show side. We're using really fresh epoxy. It makes this very easy. If you're using epoxy that's too old, it can make this process much harder. So the first thing you should do after you mix up for your second mixing on your fish is always do the eye. You know, at this point, we're just going to check it from all those angles again. We have a little bit of epoxy we need to just pull down from the front part of the eye with our brush. We'll just dab off the excess water, check it once more. And see what we did. Okay, now we're going to rebuild the gullet area. This is this whole area here, and it all shrunk in during the drying process. You don't necessarily need to get a lot of epoxy here, just enough to completely fill in all the shrunken areas. We're going to be taking our finger here and we're really going to be smoothing that in to the gill rakers and under the jawbone area of the fish. See, I keep getting my finger back into that hot water. It makes it much easier to smooth this epoxy out. And we'll work on the back side of the fish the same way. Set it back down on my workbench, and I just look at it from a number of different angles and make sure everything's nice and smooth. Dab off the excess water. I'll take my modeling tool and I'm just going to make a line directly underneath the jawbone, right where it meets the gullet area. That just gives a little bit of a delineation at that point. You know, I just check my eyes again, make sure I didn't bump them and that there's no excess water. Sometimes if you let them sit a little bit, you'll see we need to smooth something in. And I see right on the top of this eye, it needs to be smoothed a little bit. Can't be too careful with this step. Okay, we're going to take one more look inside the mouth. If you wanted to, you can rebuild the tongue and you can rebuild the inner part of this gum area. I'm just going to rebuild the tongue a little bit. You don't need a lot of epoxy for this. The tongue does have a tendency to shrink down a little bit. Okay, and I'm going to rebuild the inner part of the gum a little bit where it's shrunk in. I'll show you what I'm doing here in a second. You can see how we rebuilt that area there. And do the same on the other side. You can cut your gloves fairly easily in the mouth if they get cut on the teeth. So keep that in mind. You want to be a little careful. If you do get a hole in your gloves, I would immediately change them. That's been rebuilt. I'm just going to take my paper towel, just dab off any excess moisture in there. Now we're going to rebuild the lip line. The lip line on a largemouth bass is fairly pronounced, and it needs to be rebuilt if you're not going to be using an artificial head. Work on the back side a little bit, make sure it's nice and smoothed in. Again, we'll just take our paper towel and dab that off. You can also rebuild some of the upper part of the lip area if you feel you need to. This one didn't really shrink down too much. I'm not really going to do much rebuilding up here. It looks really good. The only other thing we have to do with the epoxy step, I'm going to take a little bit of epoxy and fill in the holes in the gill cover. Doesn't take much to do this. If you miss a hole, you will see it when you start painting with white paint. So you can always repair that later. That'll be your final test to see how well your epoxying was as soon as the paint hits it. And there we have it. The fish is completely epoxied and it's now ready for the paint booth. We'll set this aside overnight to dry. Now that the epoxy has dried on our fish, we need to just put our final coat of fin glue on the show side of the fin. If you recall from the rest of the fin lesson, we did the back side of the fin when we put our backing on each of these fins. So now we just have to do the show side. Again, we're going to be using an acid brush for that and our tacky glue. You don't want to put too much glue on at one time. You don't want it to run. You just want to put enough on that it completely covers everything. Put some on these little spikes by our anal fin as well, right here. Go ahead and flip that over and we'll put a little bit of glue right there. put a little bit on our spiny dorsal. This is the first coat of glue this is getting, and it only needs one coat. Okay, now all the fins are done. We're just going to go around and look for any raised scales. We can actually put a little bit of glue underneath those and to fill that in. If you don't do that and the scales stay raised, and if they're not filled or ironed down, they'll have a black hollow look when you put your paint on them. If you get in the paint booth and you have that, you can glue it again in the paint booth, and we'll be going over that when we paint this bass. See, I'm taking my finger and just spreading that glue in underneath those scales. Just like epoxy, we're just working it in so there's no abrupt lines or there's no big running streams of it anywhere on the fish. You would never want that. Sometimes up by the head you can have a little bit of raised scales. We'll just go over that area. Okay, now we have all of that done. We can set this aside and let it dry. I would recommend letting this dry at least 4 hours before you proceed to the painting step.